The cutting torch was already lit when Owen Hale saw the copper line. A blue flame hissed beside the old wrecker's cab, while two scrapyard workers dragged a chain beneath the front axle. One of them drew a white line across the rusted door. Carl Danner stood nearby with a clipboard. "Cab first," he said. "Then the boom. We can have the frame on the scale before dark." Owen stepped between the torch and the truck. "Wait." The worker lowered the flame. Carl checked his watch. "You had 3 weeks to wait." The wrecker sat at the edge of Owen's rented yard, surrounded by weeds, worn tires, and machines waiting for parts. Its front tires were flat. Rust had opened holes beneath both doors. The windshield had clouded around the edges, and the recovery boom leaned toward the passenger side from years of worn bushings. Carl called it 4,800 pounds of recoverable steel. The property owner called it something that had to be gone within 10 days. Owen called it his uncle's truck. Vernon Hale had operated the wrecker for almost 30 years, recovering tractors from flooded fields, grain trucks from washed-out ditches, and logging equipment from roads too soft for modern recovery vehicles. When Vernon died, the truck passed to Owen with a box of tools, several unpaid invoices, and no explanation for why it had been taken out of service. Owen had planned to restore it. Then the engine seized. The winch locked. Both rear tires split. 6 years passed while he repaired other people's equipment and postponed his own. Now the property had been sold. The truck had become a deadline. A pickup entered the yard and stopped beside the workshop. Mara Hale climbed out carrying a toolbox and 2 cups of coffee. She was Owen's younger cousin, and the only other mechanic who still joined him on difficult farm repairs. Vernon had died before she was old enough to work beside him, but she had grown up hearing stories about the red-boomed wrecker. She looked at the torch. "You started without me? We were about to," Carl said. Owen pointed beneath the cab. "Look at that line." Torchlight reflected from a narrow copper tube running beside the fuel tank. It rose toward the cab and disappeared through a drilled opening behind the driver's seat. Mara crouched beside it. "That is not factory hydraulic tubing." "No. Too small for main pressure, and too deliberate to be abandoned plumbing." Owen climbed onto the running board and leaned through the open door. Behind the seats was a flat steel wall stretching across the cab. He had seen it hundreds of times. He had never looked at it closely. The surrounding cab metal had been stamped into smooth factory curves. The wall was flat plate. Its welds were uneven, and the lower seam had been sealed with a dark compound. Mara tapped the center with a wrench. Hollow. She moved left. Solid. Then right. Solid again. "There is a mechanism behind the center section," she said. Carl climbed onto the running board. "Your uncle built a cupboard." "With a copper line entering it?" Owen asked. "Maybe he kept coffee warm." Mara ignored him and pulled rotted insulation from the lower seam. A second opening appeared near the floor. A steel control rod passed through it and disappeared behind the wall. The rod had been cut several inches outside the panel. Its end was clean. Torch cut. Someone had intentionally removed the handle. Owen gripped the remaining section. "Do not force it," Mara said. He pulled gently. The rod moved less than half an inch. A cable tightened behind the wall. Then, beneath the cab, something heavy scraped along the frame. The rear suspension settled slightly. At the same moment, the front of the truck rose against its flat tires. A dull impact sounded from somewhere under the rear deck. Carl stopped smiling. "What was that?" Owen eased the rod in the opposite direction. The cable reversed. Under the chassis, the hidden mass scraped forward and struck another stop. The truck rocked once, then settled. Mara placed one hand against the wall. "The weight is not inside here." "No," Owen said. "This is controlling something under the truck." He released the rod. A final metallic click came from behind the panel, followed by a faint knock beneath the chassis. Near the lower edge, Mara found shallow marks beneath the faded paint. She scraped them clean with the corner of her wrench. 3 words appeared: "Shift before load." Owen read them twice. It was not a warning about opening the wall. It was an operating instruction. Something beneath the truck had to change position before the winch carried tension. Carl climbed down. It does not change the deadline. No, Owen said. He looked at the cut control rod, the copper line, and the sealed control chamber Vernon had built behind the cab. But it changes what you are cutting. Owen turned toward the worker holding the torch. Shut it off. Carl's expression hardened. You are making a mistake. Maybe. Beneath the truck, the hidden carriage settled against the rail with one final click. Owen kept his eyes on the wall. But this truck stays whole until I know what Vernon built and why he made sure no one could use it again. By the next morning, Owen had heard the same conclusion from nearly everyone he called. The truck was finished. A diesel mechanic said rebuilding the seized engine would cost more than the wrecker could ever earn back. A hydraulic shop warned that the failed hoses and seals alone would consume most of Carl's offer. The tire dealer refused to discuss replacements until Owen proved the old wheels were still usable. The evidence supported them. The engine would not turn. The winch drum had frozen beneath rust and hardened grease. One boom pivot bushing had worn almost completely through. Both rear tires were split. The cab floor had rusted beneath the pedals, and the brake pedal sank without resistance. On paper, the wrecker had no sensible future. Carl returned before lunch with a revised scrap estimate. He placed it on Owen's workbench. That is the best price you are going to get. Owen studied the number. It was slightly higher than the previous offer. You added something. Copper, Carl said. Since you found that line? Owen pushed the estimate back. You still think that is all it is? I think metal is worth what metal weighs. Carl nodded toward the yard. That truck has no engine anyone trusts. No brakes anyone can use. And no boom that would pass inspection. You are not saving a machine. You are delaying a cutting job. Owen looked through the workshop door. The white chalk line remained across the cab. For a moment, he tried to see the truck the way Carl did. Steel frame, cast iron block, copper tubing, ruined rubber, measured separately. Carl might have been right. The wrecker could be worth more in pieces than as a whole. But Vernon had never measured machines that way. When Owen was 12, his father, Daniel Hale, died in a road accident. Vernon took Owen in without discussion. He cleared a room above the workshop, gave him one shelf for his clothes, and put him to work the following Monday. Vernon was not an affectionate man. He did not give speeches. He taught by assigning responsibility. At first, Owen swept floors and cleaned tools. Then he learned to grease winch bearings, inspect cable strands, place cribbing beneath recovery legs, and watch the truck while someone else watched the load. Vernon's rules were simple. Never stand inside a loaded cable angle. Never trust hydraulic pressure as the only support, and never begin a pull until you understand where the weight will move. The last rule had seemed obvious when Owen was a boy. Years later, he understood that most operators watched only the machine being recovered. Vernon studied the recovery truck first. Its suspension, the slope beneath its tires, the boom angle, the way the front axle became lighter as cable tension increased. Mara entered the workshop carrying a box of cleaned fittings. Carl still trying to buy it by the pound? He raised the offer. That generous? He counted the copper. She looked toward the cab. Then he is still counting the wrong thing. Owen picked up one of Vernon's old photographs. It showed the wrecker beside an irrigation pond, connected to a loaded grain truck, buried deep in spring mud. A newer recovery truck stood farther back with its front wheels lifted from the ground. Owen remembered that day. He had been 14. The larger truck had tried twice and slid backward both times. Vernon positioned his smaller wrecker at an angle. Before touching the winch controls, he climbed into the cab and reached behind the seat. A cable moved behind the wall. Then steel scraped beneath the chassis. The rear of the truck settled. The front suspension compressed instead of extending. Throughout the pull, the front tires remained planted. At the time, Owen assumed Vernon had lowered an ordinary support. Now he remembered the exact sound. The same sound they had heard when he moved the cut control rod. Mara studied the photograph. You were there? Yes. Did you see what he moved? No. Did your father? The question made Owen pause. Daniel had worked with Vernon before the road accident. Owen remembered scars across his father's right hand and a shoulder that never moved properly in cold weather. The family had always called it an old shop injury. Vernon had never explained further. Maybe. Owen said, You think the truck was involved? I think Vernon stopped talking about it whenever my father entered the room. That was not proof. But it gave the hidden mechanism a history Owen had never considered. He climbed into the cab again. Wear marks around the cut control rod showed years of use. The rod had not broken. A torch had removed it cleanly. 4 empty mounting holes beside the driver's seat showed where a lever bracket had once been attached. Above them, the warning remained visible, shift before load. Someone had deliberately disabled the system after years of operation. Owen photographed the copper line, the cut rod, the bracket holes, and the sealed wall. Then he searched old service manuals for the truck's model. None showed a wall behind the seats. None showed a movable mechanism beneath the chassis. None showed copper tubing connected to the rear frame. One restoration mechanic warned him not to move the system again until he knew what restrained the hidden mass. Another asked a different question. Does the truck sit normally front to rear? Owen stepped outside with a tape measure. The rear suspension sat lower than factory specifications suggested. At the front axle, the gap between the frame and suspension was larger than expected. Even with flat tires and worn springs, the truck appeared unusually rear-heavy. The rear is low, Owen said. The front looks unloaded. Then whatever moves beneath the truck may already be sitting too far back. Owen looked toward the torch-cut rod. Why remove the handle? To make sure the next operator could not move it. After the call, Mara joined him beside the truck. You still planning to save it? I am planning to find out why Vernon disabled it. That was not my question. Owen looked at the chalk line across the cab, at the sealed wall, at the machine that had once kept its front tires planted when a larger truck could not. No, he said. I am not ready to save it. Mara waited. But I am not letting anyone cut it apart before I understand what failed. Beneath the chassis, the hidden carriage settled faintly against the rail. Not enough to move the truck. Enough to remind them that whatever Vernon had disabled was still capable of moving. Owen spent the next morning proving what the truck had not been built with. The service manual he found online was incomplete. So he and Mara drove 20 miles to an agricultural equipment dealer that still kept old technical binders and microfilm. The parts manager located the correct model and spread 3 factory diagrams across the counter. Behind the driver's seat, the original cab contained an open storage shelf. No steel wall. No control rod. No copper tubing. No hidden chamber. The manager studied Owen's photographs. That panel was added later. Dealer option? Not one I have ever seen. Owen pointed to the narrow copper line entering the lower corner. Could it carry hydraulic pressure? Not main pressure. Copper that small would fatigue. What would it carry? A low-pressure signal. Air. Light hydraulic fluid. Maybe a pilot line controlling a valve somewhere else. The answer gave Owen less certainty than he wanted. The tube was too small to move anything heavy. It probably told another part of the truck when to act. But the factory drawing showed no system that required such a signal. Whatever Vernon had built was entirely his own. Back at the yard, Mara crawled beneath the chassis, while Owen moved the cut control rod gently from inside the cab. The rod turned a bell crank mounted between the frame rails. One arm pulled a heavy cable toward the rear deck. The other disappeared beneath a steel housing welded into the chassis. Move it again, Mara called. Owen pulled the rod a fraction. Steel scraped beneath the cab. Not inside the wall. Under the truck, Mara aimed her flashlight between the frame rails. 2 reinforced channels ran lengthwise beneath the chassis. Bright wear marks showed that something heavy had traveled along them for years. Forward. Backward. Then stopped. The moving mass is under the truck, Mara said. Owen climbed down beside her. Then the wall holds the controls, or whatever was supposed to stop it. They followed the rails toward the rear axle. Near the end stood a thick steel stop block. A crack ran through its center. The damaged edges had been polished by repeated impact. Owen touched the fractured steel. This was hit more than once, by whatever moved on the rails. The mass could travel. The question was whether anything still held it in position. Owen returned to the cab and pulled the rod again. The carriage beneath the frame moved several inches. The rear of the truck settled. At the same time, the front suspension extended. Mara measured the gap above the front axle. Less weight on the front. Owen released the rod. The carriage did not return. The truck remained rear-heavy. The system could still shift weight, but no visible part locked it. That afternoon, Owen and Mara searched Vernon's old records. Most of the boxes contained ordinary paperwork, fuel receipts, chain orders, customer invoices, repair notes written on the backs of envelopes. Near the bottom of one box, Owen found a folded sheet labeled Hale Recovery Modification Log. The first entries described ordinary work: reinforced, boom mount, extended rear outriggers, added auxiliary winch brake. Then came one line that matched what they had found beneath the truck: installed transfer rail and cab control. Test load successful. Several pages were missing. The next surviving entry had been written years later: reopened rear wall, replace stop block, weight shifted under emergency pull. Below it, Vernon had added one final warning: do not return truck to service until secondary lock is installed. Mara read the sentence twice. There was already a first lock, and it failed. Did he build the second one? There is no record. They searched the remaining papers but found no drawing, no dimensions, no parts list. Only one photograph. It showed the wrecker pulling a loaded grain truck from a flooded field. The front tires remained planted. The rear sat lower than normal. On the back, Vernon had written, counterweight, rearward. No front lift. Nothing about the copper line. Nothing about the wall. Only the result. Carl entered the workshop as Owen laid the modification log beside the scrap estimate. So what did you find? A system that moved weight through the frame. Carl glanced toward the truck. That sounds like more scrap. It kept the front axle planted during a pull. And when it failed, Owen pointed toward the cracked stop block. The weight moved farther than it should have. Carl looked at the warning in the log. Secondary lock. Yes. Do you know what it looked like? No. Do you know whether Vernon started building it? No. Carl folded his arms. Then you found an unfinished machine? Owen looked toward the wall. No. I found an unfinished safety system. Near the cut control rod, 4 empty mounting holes showed where the original lever bracket had once been attached. Beside them were 3 smaller circular impressions in the steel, too evenly spaced to be accidental. Mara cleaned one with a wire brush. Guide marks? Maybe. For the second lock, or only layout points? No pin remained. No bracket connected the marks to the moving carriage. The impressions proved only that Vernon had started planning another part of the system. They did not reveal its shape or show whether any of it had been completed. Owen studied the wall. The upper weld was narrow and consistent. The lower seam was rougher, darker, and overheated. Someone had opened the panel after the original installation and sealed it again. Mara looked through the opposite door. We know the system moved weight. We know the first lock failed. And we know Vernon wanted another one. Owen nodded. But we still do not know what he left behind. He marked a small inspection opening near the upper center of the wall, far from the copper fitting and control rod. Then he blocked the transfer carriage beneath the truck from both directions. Mara painted alignment marks across the rod, cable, and bell crank. If anything moves, stop. Owen fitted a drill bit into the chuck. The machine behind the wall was no longer a mystery about hidden strength. It was a known failure with an unfinished safeguard. The drill touched the steel. For the first time, Owen was not asking what Vernon had hidden. He was asking whether the wall contained the beginning of the lock he never finished. Owen did not open the wall the next morning. Before cutting into the mechanism, he wanted to find someone who had seen the system work and someone who understood why Vernon stopped trusting it. He and Mara began with Harold Pike, a retired grain farmer who lived beside an abandoned feed mill. Harold recognized the photograph immediately. "I thought that truck had been cut apart years ago." "It almost was," Owen said. He placed the photograph and Vernon's modification log on the kitchen table. "This grain truck belonged to you?" "Loaded with corn. Buried nearly to the differential. Another recovery truck tried first." Harold nodded. "Bigger truck. More power. Its front wheels lifted as soon as the cable tightened." "What did Vernon do differently?" "He made everyone wait." "For what?" Harold pointed toward the cab in the photograph. "He climbed inside and moved something behind the seat." "Did you see it?" "No. But I heard steel moving beneath the truck." Owen looked at Mara. The sound matched the carriage sliding along the rails. "What happened after that?" "The rear settled. Then he pulled?" "Not right away. He checked the ground again, moved one support, and changed the cable angle." Harold gave a faint smile. Vernon never treated the lever like it solved everything. That mattered. The hidden system helped the truck. It did not replace judgment. "Do you know why he stopped using it?" Owen asked. Harold's expression changed. "I heard Daniel was hurt. My father never told me how." "Then Silas Reed is the man you need." Silas had helped Vernon reinforce the transfer rails and fabricate several modifications for the wrecker. His shop stood behind his house, surrounded by weathered steel and machines repaired too many times to resemble their factory versions. He recognized the photograph immediately. "You still have that machine?" "For a few more days." Silas set the photograph down. "Have you moved the carriage?" "Only while the truck was unloaded." "Did it stay where you placed it?" "It stopped moving." "That is not the same as locking." Owen placed Vernon's modification log on the bench. Silas read the final warning: "Do not return truck to service until secondary lock is installed." "What was the first lock?" Owen asked. "A spring-loaded pawl behind the wall." "The lever moved the carriage?" "Yes." "And the pawl dropped into position?" "When everything lined up." "What caused it to miss?" "Wear?" "Dirt." "Frame movement." A pawl can sound engaged while sitting against the edge of a notch. Owen thought of the click he had heard behind the panel. "So the operator could believe it was locked?" "Yes. And not know otherwise until the cable loaded." Silas nodded. Owen pointed to the cracked stop block in Vernon's notes. "When did that happen?" Silas looked at him for several seconds. "The night your father was injured." The workshop became quiet. Owen thought of Daniel Hale's scarred right hand and the shoulder that never moved properly in cold weather. The family had always called it an old shop accident. "What happened?" "A fuel truck slid toward a creek during a storm. The driver was trapped. Vernon refused the recovery. The lock had already begun giving trouble. He said the wrecker was not safe. But Daniel took it." "Yes." "Why?" Silas did not answer. He did not need to. Someone was trapped. The truck could reach him. Daniel believed one emergency pull could be managed. "What happened when the cable loaded?" Owen asked. "The carriage shifted." "How far?" "Far enough to hit the rear stop." "The truck overturned?" "Almost." Daniel released the winch before it went over. The control lever kicked back and threw him across the cab. Owen remembered the scars across his father's fingers. "He never told me." "You were 10. Did Vernon repair the truck?" "He recovered it the next morning. Opened the wall. Removed damaged parts. Replaced the stop block. And then he stopped." "Why?" "Because the first lock had failed, and he no longer believed one safeguard was enough." Owen looked at the modification log. "The secondary lock?" "Yes." "What did it look like?" Silas shook his head. "Vernon never showed me a finished design. But he started something. I know he began laying out a second restraint independent of the pawl." "What kind?" "I cannot tell you what he never finished." The answer frustrated Owen. It also felt honest. Owen pointed to the copper line in the photograph. What did that control? Some kind of low-pressure signal. For ballast? Possibly. Was it involved in the accident? Silas took his time answering. The truck continued farther into the sequence than it should have. Was a safeguard broken? Maybe. Bypassed? Maybe. Did Daniel do it? Silas looked directly at him. I know Daniel took the truck. I know the carriage shifted. I know the recovery continued when Vernon believed the machine should have stopped. That is all? That is all I can prove. The wall might still contain physical evidence. A broken linkage, a forced valve, a piece of wire, but even if they found it, it would not identify the hand that altered it. Silas opened a drawer beneath the welding bench and removed a curved steel template. 3 positions were stamped across it: road, pull, rear. Beside each slot was a circular opening. Owen recognized the spacing from the marks beside the cut control rod. What is this? Vernon's layout plate. For the second lock? For part of it. What part? The fixed side. Owen turned it over. No dimensions. No drawing. No explanation. Where is the rest? There was no rest when he gave it to me. Why keep it? Because he asked me to. For how long? Until someone opened the wall? Mara stepped closer. And what was that person supposed to find? Silas pointed to the circular openings. Whether Vernon had built anything behind them. The template proved the marks beside the lever were intentional. It did not explain what passed through them. A pin. A latch. A sliding bar. That answer still waited behind the wall. Before leaving, Owen asked one final question. How do we test the old Paul without repeating the accident? Restrain the carriage from both directions. How much travel? Almost none. Then add load, the lowest measurable amount. And stop at the first movement. No full pull. No assumption that a click means locked. Owen folded the template into the modification log. Silas looked at him. Your uncle did not seal the wall because the idea had no value. Then why? Because value is not the same as permission to use it. Owen and Mara returned to the yard after dark. The wrecker stood beneath the workshop lights, with the carriage near the road position. Owen placed Silas's template against the marks beside the control rod. The openings aligned. Mara looked at the sealed panel. We know the first lock failed. Yes. And Vernon began laying out something separate from it. But we do not know what, or how much he finished. Owen looked toward the crawler tractor behind the workshop. Silas had given them a way to test the old lock without allowing the carriage to gather momentum. The wrecker was no longer hiding a perfect invention. It was hiding a failed safeguard, an unfinished correction, and evidence of a recovery that continued when the machine should have stopped. Tomorrow, we test only whether the first lock holds. Owen said, and if it moves, we stop. Then open the wall? Owen nodded. Then we let the machine show us what Vernon never finished. Owen did not connect the winch at full load the next morning. Before opening the wall, he wanted to know whether the counterweight could remain fixed when the frame began to flex. He and Mara chained the carriage from both directions and left almost no room for it to travel. White paint marked its position against the rail. The truck rested on heavy stands and timber cribbing. Nothing depended on hydraulic pressure alone. Carl watched from behind a steel barrier. You are testing a truck that cannot even drive. I am testing the lock. They connected a short section of rated cable to the old crawler tractor behind the workshop. The tractor could not move. It only provided resistance. Mara checked the chains. Secure. Owen took up the slack. The cable tightened. The wrecker settled against its supports. Nothing moved beneath the frame. He increased the load slowly. A faint click came from behind the cab. Mara raised one hand. Stop. Owen released the control. The cable went slack. The white marks no longer aligned. The carriage had shifted only a fraction. The chains had caught it before it could gather momentum. Carl approached after the line was fully unloaded. That is all it moved? That is all we allowed it to move. Owen said, and without the chains? It could have reached the cracked stop. Fresh metal showed where the carriage had slid against the rusted rail. The distance was small. The timing was not. It had remained still while the truck stood unloaded. It moved only after cable tension flexed the chassis. That was exactly when the lock mattered most. Mara studied the control rod. It may have been resting against a worn notch, or against what is left of the pawl. Either way, it only looked locked. Owen looked toward the sealed wall. The test had answered the important question. The first lock did not hold under load. Carl folded his arms. Then you already know it is broken. I know it does not hold. What else is there to know? Whether Vernon's second lock was only a plan or whether he built part of it. Owen removed the test cable. Mara tagged the winch controls and added another restraint around the carriage. No more load would be applied until they saw the mechanism. Carl checked the deadline notice on the workshop door. 3 days. Owen placed one hand against the steel panel. Until that morning, opening it had been part of an investigation. Now it was necessary before any repair could begin. Drain the ballast system, he said. Mara picked up the white paint. I will mark every connection. And if anything moves, we stop. Owen looked at the cut control rod and the warning beneath the old paint. Shift before load. The words described what the operator had to do. The failed lock explained why that was not enough. We find out what was supposed to hold it, Owen said. Owen and Mara began by making sure nothing behind the wall could move. They drained the ballast tank beneath the rear deck. Brown water came first. Then rust-colored sediment. When the flow stopped, Owen capped the main hose and left the narrow copper line attached. The carriage beneath the truck was chained from both directions. Steel blocks closed the ends of the rails. Mara marked the control rod, câble, and bell crank with white paint. Any movement? She said. We stop. Any sound we do not understand? We stop. Only then did Owen return to the cab. The first warning remained visible above the cut control rod. Shift before load. Mara pulled away the rotted insulation beneath it. A second line appeared through the dirt. Owen cleaned the paint carefully. Lock weight before filling. They read the two instructions together. Move the counterweight before loading the winch. Lock it before adding ballast. The copper line was no longer just an unexplained signal. It connected the locking system to whatever controlled the rear tank. Owen placed Silas's template over the marks beside the rod. The road, pull, and rear positions aligned. Beside them, the circular openings suggested a second mechanical restraint independent of the original pawl, but they still did not show its shape, or whether Vernon had completed any part of it. We start small, Owen said. He marked a narrow inspection opening near the upper center of the wall, away from the copper fitting and control rod. The first drill bit dulled before breaking through. Vernon had used plate, not ordinary cab steel. Owen cut the remaining edges slowly, stopping after each section while Mara checked the white marks. No movement. He bent the small flap outward. Damp metallic air escaped from the chamber. The flashlight revealed a pulley mounted inside a reinforced frame. The main cable crossed it before descending toward the transfer rails. Beside it sat a spring housing. Below that ran a toothed locking bar. Several teeth had worn smooth. One had broken away. The primary lock, Mara said. Part of it? Owen moved the light lower. A broken steel pawl lay at the bottom of the chamber beside the damaged spring housing. The failed part had never been removed. It had fallen inside and remained there when Vernon sealed the wall. Then, Mara noticed a thinner cable running from the lock toward the copper control line. Owen traced it with the light. When the pawl engaged, this cable must have allowed the next step, and if it did not engage, the valve should have stayed closed. Mara leaned closer. Then how did the system continue during the emergency pull? Owen changed the light angle. A short loop of baling wire had been wrapped around the interlock arm. Holding it away from the locking mechanism, the valve could operate whether the pawl was seated or not. Someone had defeated the safeguard that was supposed to stop the sequence. Owen stared at the wire. It explained how the truck had continued after the lock failed. It did not prove who had tied it there. Carl appeared at the running board. So the machine did not fail by itself. The pawl failed, Owen said, and someone made sure that failure did not stop the next step. Carl looked through the opening. Why would anyone do that? To keep working when the machine was trying to stop them. The answer could have applied to Daniel's emergency recovery. It could also have described an earlier shortcut left in place for years. The wall preserved the alteration, not the hand that made it. Mara studied the broken pawl. One worn part controlled too much. Yes. And the second restraint? Still hidden lower in the wall. Owen removed the baling wire with long-nosed pliers. The interlock arm snapped back toward the locking bar. A dull knock sounded inside the chamber. The copper line shifted slightly where it entered the panel. The design had been simple. No lock meant no ballast. The wire had erased that protection. Carl looked at the cutting tools. You already know what went wrong. We know what failed first. And how the truck kept operating. Yes. What else is there? Owen looked at the circular openings in Silas's template. Whether Vernon left enough of the second safeguard for us to finish. He photographed the broken pawl, the worn teeth, and the bypass wire before moving anything else. Then he marked the larger center panel for removal. Mara checked the restraints beneath the chassis one more time. Still fixed. Owen lifted the cutting wheel. The small opening had shown them, the failed lock, and the shortcut that defeated it. The lower chamber would show whether Vernon had left only evidence of the failure or the beginning of a way to prevent it from happening again. Owen began cutting only after checking every restraint again. The ballast tank was empty. The transfer carriage was chained from both directions. Steel blocks closed both ends of the rails. White paint marks across the control rod. Câble and bell crank remained aligned. Nothing behind the wall carried pressure. Nothing beneath the chassis had room to gather momentum. Mara watched the marks while Owen extended the inspection opening along the center panel. The cutting wheel moved slowly through Vernon's steel plate. After every short section, Owen stopped. Mara checked beneath the truck. No movement. He continued. When the final edge separated, Owen supported the panel before easing it away from the cab frame. The opening exposed the full control assembly, the upper pulley, the damaged spring housing, the worn locking bar, the ballast interlock they had already inspected through the smaller opening. Below those parts, however, the chamber widened toward the floor. That lower section had remained hidden. Mara aimed her flashlight into it. There, a rectangular block of steel rested beneath the mechanism. Owen reached through with a magnetic pickup tool. The block shifted, but would not lift. Together, they raised it through the opening and placed it on the cab floor. One end had cracked nearly through. The opposite face carried deep, polished impact marks. Owen recognized its shape. The original rear stop block. The one Vernon replaced after the emergency pull? He nodded. The block beneath the chassis was the replacement. This was the failed one. A date had been stamped into its side. Below the date, Vernon had scratched 3 words. Failed under load. Mara turned the block beneath the work light. He sealed it inside the wall, so it would stay with the mechanism. As a warning, or as evidence? The heavy object Owen had heard during the first inspection had not been the moving counterweight. It was the broken stop block shifting inside the chamber as the truck rocked. The true counterweight remained beneath the chassis. Traveling along the reinforced rails, Vernon had hidden the failed part beside the control system that had allowed it to fail. Carl stood on the running board and looked through the open wall. All that work for a weight under the truck. Not just a weight, Owen said. He pointed beneath the floor. A conventional heavy wrecker carries its recovery mass everywhere. So it can sink into soft ground before it reaches the machine that needs pulling. Owen traced the cable from the control rod toward the carriage. Vernon kept this truck lighter while traveling. At the job, he moved the steel rearward, locked it, then added water to the ballast tank. Carl looked toward the muddy edge of the yard. A modern truck carries that weight all the time. Yes. And this one added it only when needed. Exactly. Carl glanced at the failed stop block. and when the lock did not hold, the same movement became the danger. The design was not hidden strength. It was controlled weight, useful only when the sequence remained intact. Mara placed Silas's steel template over the fixed mounting points beside the control rod. The three openings aligned with reinforced sections inside the wall. Road. Boule. Rear. For the first time, they could see what lay directly behind them. Steel guide bosses had already been welded into the fixed frame. Vernon had completed the stationary half of the secondary lock. Owen aimed the flashlight through the first opening. Beyond the guide boss sat the moving carriage structure beneath the cab. No matching hole passed through it. He checked pull. Then rear. The result was the same. The fixed side is finished. Mara said, but the carriage was never drilled. Then the pin could never pass through both. Owen nodded. Vernon had not left behind a completed lock, waiting to be reinstalled. He had left the first half of one. The wall contained the guide points. Silas had preserved the template. The modification log recorded the reason, but no physical connection had ever been completed between the cab frame and the moving carriage. Mara studied the spacing. A cross pin through here would trap the carriage directly, independent of the spring pawl. So if the pawl slipped under frame flex, the pin would still hold the weight. Carl leaned closer. You would have to drill through the carriage in all three positions. Yes. Build the pin. Yes. Repair the primary lock. Yes. And reconnect the ballast interlock. Yes. Carl looked at the deadline notice on the workshop door. You have less than 2 days. Owen lifted the failed stop block. The crack ran almost entirely through the steel. This part was never supposed to carry the recovery load. But it did, because the first lock failed, and the second one did not exist. Carl shook his head. You opened the wall and found another reason to scrap the truck. Owen set the block beside Vernon's modification log. No. He placed Silas's template next to it. I found the reason Vernon stopped using it. That sounds like the same thing. It is not. Owen looked at the exposed guide bosses and the undrilled carriage behind them. Scrap meant the system had no useful purpose. This system had worked. It had kept the front axle planted during recoveries that defeated heavier trucks. But it had depended on one wearing lock, and someone had forced its interlock out of sequence. Vernon had recognized the weakness. He had removed the controls, preserved the failed part, recorded the required repair, and begun building a second mechanical barrier. He simply had not finished it. The truck did not need Owen to prove Vernon had been right about everything. It needed him to make sure the same failure could not happen twice. Mara carried the measurements from the guide bosses to the workbench. Owen followed with the template and failed stop block. Carl remained beside the open cab. What do you build first? Owen placed a hardened axle pin across the drawing. A lock that does not depend on springs, câble, or whether the operator hears a click. Outside, the demolition deadline moved 1 day closer. Inside the workshop, the mystery behind the wall was over. What remained was the unfinished repair. Owen began with the crosspin. The hardened axle pin he found in the parts yard was too long and slightly oversized. He cut it down, turned it smooth on the lathe, and rounded the leading edge so it could enter the guide sleeve without catching. Mara fabricated the sleeve from thick steel tubing. It would pass through the reinforced cab frame and align with the moving carriage beneath the wall. When the counterweight reached road, pulle, or rear, the holes would line up. The spring pawl would engage first. The crosspin would follow. If the pawl, câble, or spring failed, the carriage would still be trapped mechanically. Carl watched from the workshop door. You trust one pin with all that weight? No. Owen said, that is why the pawl stays. Then which one is the real lock? Both. The original system had depended too heavily on one wearing part. Owen would not repeat that mistake. Before drilling, he repaired the primary lock. The broken tooth on the locking bar was replaced with hardened steel. The worn pawl housing received a new bushing and spring. Mara moved the temporary lever through the three marked positions. Road. The pawl clicked. Pull. Another clean engagement. Rear. The final notch held, but a click was not enough. A spring could weaken. A tooth could wear. A pawl could appear seated while resting against the edge of a notch. The crosspin had to confirm the position physically. They shifted the carriage into road and blocked it from both directions. Owen marked the center of the first hole. Mara checked the measurement twice. "You are drilling through Vernon's frame." "I know." "Still sure?" "No." She nodded. "Good." The drill entered slowly. The reinforced steel was thicker than expected. 2 bits dulled before Owen reached the moving carriage. When the hole broke through, he inserted the guide sleeve and tested the pin. It stopped halfway. "How far off?" Mara asked. "Less than 1/8 of an inch." "That is close." Close does not lock weight. They adjusted the carriage plate and aligned the sleeve again. This time, the pin passed through both structures and seated against the stop collar. A narrow steel flag rose beside the control lever. Mara smiled. "Locked." "On stands." They repeated the alignment for pull and rear. Each position had to engage the pawl before the crosspin could enter. Then Owen rebuilt the ballast interlock. The bypass wire was discarded. A new return spring held the copper pilot valve closed unless 2 conditions were met. The pawl had to be seated. The crosspin had to be fully inserted. Only then would the indicator flag rise and allow the ballast valve to open. Mara tested the sequence. With the pawl disengaged, the valve remained closed. With the pawl engaged but the pin removed, it still stayed closed. Only after the pin seated did the valve respond. "The sequence is inside the machine now," she said. "That is where it belongs." They added one more safeguard. The control lever could not move while water remained in the ballast tank. Before shifting the counterweight, the operator had to drain the system. No moving mass with added ballast. No shortcut between positions. By late afternoon, the mechanical work was complete. Owen still refused to connect the winch. First came a static test. The wrecker remained on stands with the carriage restrained from both directions. Owen moved the lever to road. The pawl clicked. The crosspin seated. The indicator flag rose. Mara applied low pressure to the copper pilot line. The main ballast valve opened. Water entered the rear tank through the larger fill hose. Nothing moved. The carriage remained fixed. They drained the tank and repeated the sequence in pull and rear. Each time, the order remained the same. Shift. POV. Crosspin. Indicator. Ballast. Carl returned as they completed the last test. "So it works. It holds without winch load." Owen said, "That is not the same thing." "No." They positioned the old crawler tractor behind the yard. The pull was straight. The gravel was level. The load was predictable. Owen placed the carriage in pull. The pawl engaged. The crosspin seated. The flag rose. Only then did Mara open the ballast valve. Water entered the rear tank. The suspension settled evenly. The front tires remained planted. Mara moved to the winch controls. Quarter load. The cable tightened. The wrecker settled onto its supports. Nothing shifted. Half load. The crawler moved several inches across the gravel. The indicator stayed raised. The crosspin did not move. Then a sharp metallic crack came from behind the cab. Mara released the winch immediately. The truck remained level. The carriage stayed locked. Owen opened the wall and found the failure. The old upper pulley bracket had split along one weld. Carl looked through the cab. "You still calling that success?" Owen examined the broken bracket. "Yes." "Why?" "Because the lock held." He pointed to the seated crosspin. The part Vernon never finished worked. Owen reached for the cutting torch. "And this time, the part that failed is one we can see." Owen repaired the pulley bracket before dark. The failed weld had joined Vernon's heavier control assembly to a thinner factory brace. The bracket had survived years of vibration. But the first meaningful load exposed the weak point around the new lock. Owen cut the damaged section away. Mara fabricated a thicker replacement plate. They added a triangular gusset and tied the bracket directly into the reinforced cab frame. When the metal cooled, they inspected the entire mechanism again. The spring pawl engaged cleanly. The secondary crosspin passed through the guide sleeve and moving carriage. The indicator flag rose beside the control lever. The ballast valve remained closed until both locks were fully seated. Nothing depended on one spring, one cable, or one click anymore. By sunrise, less than 24 hours remained before Diane Foster's demolition crew arrived. The truck was not restored, but it could move. Owen had rebuilt enough of the brakes for low-speed travel, fitted 2 borrowed rear tires, repaired the worst steering play, and sealed the cooling system. The diesel started on the second attempt. Gray smoke rolled above the yard before the engine settled into a rough idle. Mara climbed into the passenger seat. Carl followed in his pickup. Their destination was Harold Pike's abandoned feed mill. A loaded grain wagon had sunk beside a drainage ditch after the previous night's rain. It was heavy enough to test the wrecker under real conditions, but stable enough that no one would be trapped if the recovery failed. Harold stood near the mill when the old truck approached. For several seconds, he only listened to the engine. Then he placed one hand against the faded door. "I have not heard this truck in years." Owen climbed down and studied the ground. The direct route to the wagon was shorter, but the soil had turned dark and soft beneath the grass. A heavier recovery truck would have carried more pulling force. It also might have buried itself before reaching the load. Harold pointed toward a narrow strip of firmer ground uphill from the wagon. "That is where Vernon used to set it." The position created a slight side pull, but the soil contained more gravel and supported the weight better. Owen drove the wrecker onto the firmer strip. Mara placed wide timber pads beneath both rear supports. They lowered the legs until the truck settled against the slope. Then Owen climbed into the cab. Carriage to pull. Mara moved the temporary control lever. Steel traveled rearward along the transfer rails beneath the truck. The spring pawl clicked. Owen pressed against the lever. It held. Primary lock. He inserted the hardened crosspin. It passed through the reinforced frame and moving carriage. Secondary lock. The indicator flag rose. Confirmed. Only then did Mara open the ballast valve. Water entered through the large fill hose into the tank beneath the rear deck. The narrow copper line carried only the pilot signal. The rear suspension settled evenly. The front tires remained firmly planted. They routed the winch cable through a pulley block anchored beside the mill. The block reduced some of the direct side force and changed the direction of pull. No one stood inside the cable angle. No one stood behind the wagon. Mara took the rear controls. "Take the slack," Owen said. The winch turned. The cable lifted from the wet grass. The wagon shifted slightly, then stopped. The wrecker settled onto its supports. The indicator flag remained raised. "Quarter load." The cable tightened. Mud cracked around the wagon's tires. One wheel turned and sank again. Carl watched the downhill support. "That side is going deeper." Owen checked the timber pad. The softer soil beneath it had compressed almost an inch farther than the uphill side. The truck had not tilted enough to become unstable, but the ground was changing beneath the load. Vernon's pull position had moved the counterweight rearward. It had not chosen the correct balance for this particular slope. Owen raised one hand. "Stop." Mara released the winch. Carl looked at the wagon. It almost moved. "That does not matter. You have enough pull. We do not have the right balance." Owen drained part of the ballast. Only after the tank was empty did he remove the crosspin and shift the carriage one position toward road. The spring pawl engaged again. The crosspin seated. The indicator rose. This time, Mara added only half the previous amount of water. The rear of the truck rose slightly. More weight returned toward the front axle, reducing the force that had been driving the downhill support into the soil. Mara looked at the 3 lever positions. "The markings are not answers." "No." Owen said. He studied the compressed pad. They tell us where to begin. They brought the cable under tension again. The downhill support still carried more load because of the slope, but it no longer sank as quickly. The truck remained nearly level. Mara increased the pull. The wagon moved several inches, then stopped. The diesel note deepened. Carl shook his head. That is everything it has. Owen looked at the engine. It was still pulling steadily. The problem was not power. He followed the cable with his eyes. The pulley block sat too low and too far downhill. Most of the winch force was dragging the wagon forward through the mud instead of helping lift its buried wheels. Owen raised one hand again. Release it. Carl looked toward him. You are stopping twice during the same pull? Yes. It is already halfway out. That is when people convince themselves not to check anything. They released the cable completely. Then moved the pulley block farther uphill and slightly higher. The new position reduced the side load on the downhill support and directed more of the pull upward through the wagon's axle line. The adjustment took nearly half an hour. Before loading the cable again, Owen repeated the full sequence aloud. Supports. Mara checked both pads. Stable. Carriage. Set. Primary lock. Engaged. Secondary lock. Seated. Indicator. Raised. Ballast. Half tank. Cable. Clear. Only then did Mara engage the winch. The wagon moved immediately. The changed angle lifted the buried wheels as the cable pulled them forward. Mud released with a deep sucking sound. The first tire climbed onto firmer ground. Then the second. The old wrecker did not lift its front axle. It did not slide toward the ditch. It did not twist across the slope. The carriage remained locked. The ballast stayed where Owen had placed it. When the cable went slack, Harold walked toward the cab and looked through the open wall. All those years, he said, we thought Vernon's truck was stronger than the others. It was not stronger. Owen said. Harold looked toward the recovered wagon. Then what was it? Owen studied the marks left by the support pads. The first position had been wrong for the slope. The first cable angle had been wrong for the load. The machine had not corrected either mistake for him. It had only given him a way to change the truck's balance before adding force. It knew where to put the weight it already had. Carl stood beside the cab. For the first time, he was not looking at the wrecker as separate pieces of metal. The truck had passed its first real test. Not because Owen followed Vernon's markings blindly, because he understood what the markings could not decide. The machine could move the weight. The operator still had to read the ground. The demolition crew arrived at 8 the next morning. 2 flatbed trucks stopped outside the yard. A compact excavator followed behind them. Diane Foster stepped from a white SUV carrying a folder. She looked at the old wrecker. Mud from Harold Pike's field covered the tires. The engine idled steadily. The center section of the wall behind the cab remained open, exposing the repaired lock, copper pilot line, and new crosspin. For the first time in 6 years, the truck stood level. You said it would leave under its own power. Diane said, It will. That does not change the deadline. No. Anything still here by noon becomes part of the removal contract. Owen looked across the property. He had rented the workshop for 6 years, repairing other people's machines while postponing Vernon's. Now both had reached the end of their time there. Mara arrived with a machinery trailer and began loading the last tool chests. Carl stood beside the wrecker. Harold said the grain wagon came out. It did. The lock held? Yes. The ballast system? Yes. Carl looked through the open wall. How much would it cost to build that system today? You could copy the rails, tank, carriage, and controls. Owen said. That was not my question. I do not know. Carl frowned. Then how do you know the truck is worth more than scrap? Owen picked up the failed stop block from the passenger floor. The words Vernon had scratched into it were still visible. Failed under load, because cutting it apart would preserve the steel and destroy the reason the steel works together. Carl looked toward the frame. A buyer may not see it that way. Then he is not buying the truck. The excavator began tearing into the storage shed at the far end of the property. Each impact traveled through the ground. Dust rose behind the workshop. By 11:30, the tools were loaded. Only the wrecker remained. Owen checked it for travel. The ballast tank was empty. He moved the carriage into road. The primary pawl engaged. The cross pin seated. The indicator flag rose. With the weight centered, the truck sat level. Mara climbed into the passenger seat. "Where are we taking it?" Harold offered us a month in his equipment shed. And after that, Owen looked at the exposed mechanism. "For once, I would like to make that decision before someone else's deadline." He released the parking brake. The wrecker moved forward. The clutch grabbed high. The steering wandered slightly. Every loose panel rattled. But the diesel pulled steadily. When the front wheels reached the gate, Carl raised one hand. Owen stopped. Carl approached the driver's window. "I called someone." "Who?" "Neil Carver. He recovers irrigation equipment west of the county." Owen waited. "He uses a modern heavy wrecker." Carl continued. "It has more power than this truck, but it loses work when the approach ground is too soft." "You told him about Vernon's system." "I told him an old wrecker pulled Harold's wagon without lifting its front axle." "What did he say?" "He wants to see it." "The truck is not for sale." "I did not tell him it was." "Then why call him?" Carl glanced toward the demolition equipment. "Because yesterday I would have put this truck on a scale." He tapped the folded scrap estimate against his clipboard. "Today I am not sure the scale measures the part that matters." He handed Owen a business card. "If Neil sees something useful, he may hire the truck. Or the system. Or both." Mara took the card. "That sounds different from a scrap offer." "It is." Diane checked her watch beside the excavator. "You have 15 minutes. Owen eased the wrecker through the gate. The rear wheels crossed the property line at 11:48. Behind them, the excavator turned toward the workshop. Owen did not look back until they reached the county road. The building where he had spent 6 years was disappearing behind dust. The old wrecker continued toward Harold's shed under its own power. For most of its life, people had assumed Vernon had hidden more strength behind the wall. He had not. He had hidden a way to control the strength the truck already possessed. At the intersection, Mara looked at Neil Carver's card. "You going to call him?" Owen watched the road ahead. The truck still needed permanent tires, a full brake rebuild, and a guard over the exposed mechanism. One successful recovery did not make it ready for commercial work, but it had proved something the scrap estimate could not. Its value depended on remaining whole. "Yes," Owen said. "When? After we inspect every weld?" Mara smiled. Vernon would approve. Owen glanced at the indicator flag beside the control lever. "No." He would check the lock first. The wrecker climbed the hill toward Harold's farm. Behind the cab, the wall remained open. Nothing inside it was hidden anymore. But for the first time, the truck's future was. Neil Carver arrived at Harold Pike's equipment shed 3 days later. He came alone in a service pickup carrying inspection lights, pressure gauges, and a folder of recovery photographs. He did not begin by asking whether the wrecker ran. He walked around the truck twice, checked the frame rails, examined the boom mounts, measured the rear supports. Then he climbed into the cab and studied the open wall behind the seats. The counterweight carriage sat in the road position. The spring pawl was engaged. The crosspin passed through the carriage and reinforced frame. The indicator flag stood raised beside the lever. Neil pointed to the copper tube. "Pilot control?" "Yes," Owen said. "It opens the main ballast valve only after both mechanical locks engage. The water moves through the larger hose." "Yes." "And the tank has to drain before the carriage can shift." Mara showed him the drain interlock. Neil tested the lever. It would not move while water remained in the tank. "That was added later?" "Vernon designed the transfer system," Owen said. "I finished the secondary lock and rebuilt the interlocks." Neil looked through the opening again. "What failed originally?" Owen handed him the broken stop block. "Failed under load." then the worn pawl, then Vernon's modification log. Neil read the entries in silence. He documented the weakness. He knew one lock was not enough, but he returned it to service before finishing the second. "No," Owen said. "Someone else took the truck during an emergency." Neil looked toward him. "And bypassed the ballast interlock." "Yes. That matters." Carl stood near the shed door. "Why?" Neil placed the failed stop block on the workbench. "Because a dangerous machine and a safe machine used incorrectly are not the same problem." He looked at Owen. "But neither one belongs on a job until the repair is proven. That is why you are here." Neil began the inspection again. This time, he treated the truck as a recovery system rather than an old vehicle. He checked weld penetration around the guide sleeve, measured the cross-pin diameter, inspected the locking bar and pawl engagement, tested the indicator from all three carriage positions. Then he attached a gauge to the ballast pilot circuit. The valve remained closed with the pawl disengaged. Closed with the pawl engaged, but the crosspin removed. It opened only when both locks were fully seated. Neil nodded once. "That is the right sequence." "It still needs guards," Mara said. "And permanent labels?" Owen added. "Also inspection access." Neil said. "An operator should be able to see the pawl without removing half the wall." Owen showed him the hinged cover they had begun fabricating. It included a narrow viewing window over the locking mechanism. Neil approved the idea but continued writing notes. He found worn steering linkage, a questionable boom pivot, 2 brake lines that needed permanent replacement. The winch brake required a full load test before commercial use. By the end of the inspection, his list covered 2 pages. Carl looked over his shoulder. "That sounds like a rejection." "It sounds like an old truck," Neil said. He closed the folder. "The weight transfer system is the least ordinary thing wrong with it." Owen waited. "Would you use it?" "Not today." Carl folded his arms. "There it is." Neil ignored him. "I would not use any 40-year-old recovery truck commercially after one field pull." He looked at Owen. "But I would pay to finish evaluating this one." "For the truck? For what it can reach?" Neil opened the folder of photographs. The first showed a modern heavy wrecker buried to its rear axle beside an irrigation pivot. The second showed another recovery truck parked on a gravel road, while a disabled sprayer sat 200 yards into a wet field. "My truck has twice your engine power," Neil said. "It also weighs nearly twice as much before I load a cable." He pointed to the soft approach in the photograph. "Some days, strength is the reason I cannot reach the job." Owen understood. Neil did not want an antique. He wanted access. "What are you proposing?" Owen asked. "You finish the brake system, steering, boom, pivot, and guards. I provide the rated cable, test equipment, and a controlled load site. And after that, if it passes, I hire the truck and both of you for soft ground recoveries." Mara looked at Owen. "Not buy it?" "No," Neil said. "The system is not valuable without someone who understands how to position it." Carl glanced at the open wall. "So the operator is part of the machine." "The operator is part of every recovery system," Neil replied. "This one simply makes that harder to forget." Owen looked at Vernon's sequence written on the temporary instruction plate. Shift before load. Lock weight before filling. Read the ground before pulling. For years, people had called the wrecker obsolete because it lacked automatic controls. But Vernon had never tried to automate judgment. He had built a machine that gave the operator more ways to control balance and more responsibility for using them correctly. Neil extended his hand. "I am not offering you a favor." Owen looked at it. "What are you offering?" "A chance to prove this works more than once." Owen shook his hand. Carl picked up his old scrap estimate from the workbench. He looked at the number, folded the paper, and tore it in half. Mara noticed. "Steel price drop?" Carl placed the pieces in his pocket. "No." He looked through the open wall at the carriage. "Locks and ballast controls. I measured the wrong thing. Outside the shed, The old wrecker stood on concrete with its weight centered for travel. It had not yet earned a place on Neil's recovery crew. But it had crossed a more important line. No one in the room was asking what it weighed anymore. It took Owen and Mara 3 weeks to complete Neil's inspection list. They rebuilt the remaining brake lines, replaced the worn steering joints, installed a new boom pivot bushing, tested the winch brake under increasing load. Then they enclosed the mechanism behind the cab with a hinged steel guard. The wall was no longer sealed. A narrow viewing window allowed the operator to see the spring pawl, crosspin, and indicator flag from the driver's seat. Beside the control lever, Mara mounted a permanent instruction plate. Shift before load. Engage primary lock. Insert secondary pin. Confirm indicator. Feel ballast. Read the ground before pulling. The sequence was no longer hidden in Vernon's notes or buried beneath old paint. It had become part of the truck. Neil arranged a controlled test at an abandoned quarry. A concrete block weighing several tons sat at the bottom of a wet incline. The load was predictable, and the ground was soft enough to challenge the wrecker without placing anyone in danger. Neil inspected the truck before the test. The guards, the brakes, the winch cable, the supports. Then he watched Owen prepare the transfer system. Carriage to pull. Mara moved a lever. The counterweight traveled rearward. The spring pawl engaged. Owen inserted the cross pin. The indicator flag rose. Only then did Mara open the ballast valve. Water entered the rear tank. The wrecker settled evenly. No shortcuts, Neil said. That is the point, Owen replied. They loaded the cable gradually. Quarter load. Half. Then full test tension. The concrete block moved up the incline. The front tires remained planted. The carriage stayed locked. Nothing shifted behind the cab. When the load reached the marked stopping point, Mara released the winch. Neil checked the cross pin, guide sleeve, and indicator. No movement. No fresh wear. No change in alignment. He closed his inspection folder. It'd pass. Owen looked at the truck. That simple? No. Neil said. That documented. The distinction mattered. The wrecker had not become safe because it completed one successful pull. It became usable because every critical step could be inspected, repeated, and stopped when something failed to confirm. Neil hired Owen and Mara for their first soft ground recovery the following week. Then another. The old wrecker did not replace his modern truck. It handled the jobs the heavier machine could not reach. Wet fields, narrow timber roads, soft approaches where carrying too much weight was its own weakness. Owen never allowed anyone to operate the transfer system without training. Before every pull, Mara spoke the sequence aloud. The words became familiar, but never casual. Several months later, Owen and Mara drove the wrecker to Silas Reed's fabrication shop. Silas walked around it slowly. He inspected the guide sleeve, tested the cross pin, and checked the ballast interlock. Then he looked through the viewing window. You finished Vernon's lock? We finished a lock. Owen said, I do not know if it is the one he would have built. Silas nodded. That is probably better. Mara handed him Vernon's modification log. On the final blank line, Owen had written, secondary lock installed. Interlock, restored. Tested under controlled load. Truck returned to service. Silas read the entry once, then closed the book. For years, everyone had called the wrecker scrap, because scrap was easy to measure. Steel could be weighed. Copper could be priced. Broken parts could be subtracted, but the scale could not measure why the parts belonged together. It could not weigh Vernon's understanding of soft ground. It could not price the sequence that kept moving weight from becoming uncontrolled force, and it could not measure the value of a failure recorded honestly enough for someone else to finish the repair. Owen closed the hinged wall behind the cab. This time, nothing important was hidden.